What we'll be focusing on this week, as mentioned, is a bit about data and how that kind of flows through Maya and how it flows through, more specifically, the DG graph, the dependency graph. So what I've got here is just a very simple example of how a float value is being transformed. So we've basically got a sine setup, which basically gives us just an up and down motion, and we can change the speed of this so that we can make it go faster. We can change how large this actually is, and we can just, if I just take that one down, we can also offset it so that we can do that, right? So all very standard Maya rigging things. And note that we can also see all of the inputs here, right? So we've got the sine scale, time one, and sine speed scale. So let's just have a quick look in the node editor here to what we actually have. Oh, so if I just leave that there. So you can see if I just open up these, we have a couple of different nodes here. So if I just press 5 on the keyboard just to show what what nodes we have here. So we've got the time node, which basically goes into a time unit conversion so that we can pass it into a multiple linear. So that's basically where we now, if I just turn around, will increase the speed. So the values on the sine block for the speed is basically the multiplying the time value so that just increases. Then that goes into an atom curve, which we just have 2 keys, which just goes infinitely oscillating just so that we get that wavy movement out of it. Then we just add in our offset value, and then we just multiply that to scale up the effect of it, right? So a fairly kind of straightforward and simple kind of rig setup that you would have in Maya, where the whole thing of actually driving the final thing here is you start with some value, you pass that through several different nodes, and in the end you get a modified value based on what you're trying to achieve, right? Again, very typical kind of Maya things. And again, I just want to mention that you can see all of this in inputs here, right? Now, the same thing is it's the same concept can be applied to pretty much anything that happens in the Maya scene. Pretty much everything that is in the Maya scene is a node, be it your locators, your multiplies, your shapes, everything is a node. So let's jump over and have a quick look at this shape. So I'm just going to turn off this. So what I've got here is I've got what was originally a cube. So you can see here it has the polycube. Then I smoothed it, I beveled it, I poked it, and then I extruded. So what we're seeing here is exactly the same thing as we were seeing on the locator. It's the same thing. You're probably familiar with this as history, because anytime that you modify a mesh or do anything, you see all of this history on it, and history is bad. That's what we all learn when we model things, right? But history is bad if you don't know how to use it. If you actually know how to use it, history is just a normal part of how Maya works. It's a normal part of having some starting data and manipulate it. So actually all of these things here, it will do exactly the same as we were looking at the locator. And I'm going to just show you here with my point about all of these things being nodes, right? If I go and graph this, you might have done this before, where you might have taken some object and graphed it, and you might not have worried too much about this or seen all of this and be like, oh, what's happening? This is a lot of things. But if you think back to what we're seeing with the locator, it's exactly the same thing. We've got a starting point. For the locator, it was just time. But here we start out with the polycube node that creates it. Then that goes into the smooth node that smooths it. The bevel that bevels it. Goes into the poke that pokes. And then the extrude. And then into the final cube shape. And this is something that's really important to understand, right? Because it's basically means that just as we did with the locator, where we could actually go in and change the values of what these different nodes were doing, we can still do the same thing here. So I can still go in and say, hey, I still have my polycube. I want it to be a bit wider, so I can still go in that and do that. And that will basically flow through that whole chain of dependencies there. So if I wasn't happy with my smooth, I could turn that off, right? And then we're basically back to what this would look like if we didn't smooth, or if we smoothed one more time, or if we just had that one smooth. And what if the bevel was, the fraction, I always do the wrong of those, if it was tighter, or what if it was bigger, right? And then the same with the poke. What if this wasn't the angle that we wanted to? We wanted to go over here, or, we can go in and do these things. And then at the very end, we could change how much do we want this to actually go out? Do we want to move it up? So it's all of these things that is really crucial to get a good understanding of how you can really go in and manipulate shape data in Maya. So just to kind of like reiterate this a bit more, I've actually got each of the steps here so that we can really see it. So what I've done is I've actually connected the output of each of those nodes into some different shapes here. We'll look at how this whole thing works in the next video, but for now, just imagine that this is basically the result of what each node does. So you can see that here is the result of the polycube one. This is the result of the smooth face one, the polybevel one, poke one, and then the final extrude. And note here, when we're looking at the inputs, as I'm clicking through these, you can see that deformer after deformer, the node after node is basically being removed, because we're not going through the whole chain of events here. So if I now go here and I click polycube, you can see that this change is going through. Even though I'm selecting this object, what I'm doing is I'm going in and I'm modifying the same node as of all of these objects are inheriting from, basically. So what I'm really doing is I'm manipulating this original result, and that result is cascading through all of these. So I can go and, really change the depth of everything. I can even go in here, if I turn off the divisions again, we can see how that goes through. Now, this is not to say that you want to have proper poly modifications on your nodes all the time, but there might be something in here that might be useful for you sometimes. For instance, one little thing could be something like the poly smooth face, where if you go in and you change the subdivision type to, I believe it is Maya Catmull Clark, what you can do is you can change the continuity. So you can see, actually doing this, you can animate the spherical object, or how much this spherical this object is. So you can go, so even if I go and say there's two subdivisions there, if we go in, we just make this 1 1 1, so that we actually end up with the sphere, we can actually go in and go to my polysmooth and animate the continuity. We can go from a cube to a sphere naturally, and instead of having to do like an awkward blend shape, but it actually goes naturally into what a sphere would be, because of it's doing all of those calculations already in the node. So it's a bit of this that we'll be poking more into now. And before we jump on to looking a bit more into shapes and everything, I want to just do one final thing here, and that is looking into just layers. Now, you might think that layers is, it's just some magical, mystical thing almost that just exists in Maya, and that's just a thing. But actually, when you create a layer here, even though it shows up here and it might seem like it's almost out of reach of something, what it actually is a node. And get ready for me to say that quite a lot. So I could do this, and I can even select it by name here. And if we go to the node editor, I can actually graph it. So you can see it actually shows up here, and it actually has a couple of outputs, and it goes into all of these annotations that I have here. So actually what I used the layer for here was just to add the white color to this. Now, what is the actual connections that's happening here? Well, you can actually see here that what's connecting out is the draw info from this layer, and that is connecting into the draw override of each of these. So if I open up that, the draw override, if you're not familiar with it, is basically, I'm going to make this a bit bigger, where if I select this, the draw override, so let's go on the annotation, under display, drawing overrides, is where you can basically override the kind of display and the display type, the colors, and all of these things. So if I just select this, you can see that I can't turn this on or off now because it's being overridden by this layer. So what it's actually doing is so if I turn this to transparent, to template, you can see that the display type has now changed to template. If I change that to reference, it's changed to reference here. If I go and turn off the visibility, you can now see that the visible is turned off here. So that's all that's really happening when you have a layer in your scene. What this is just a convenient shortcut almost for these layer nodes so that you can set these values here. So you can go in here and you can see if I now go and just click visible, these come back. If I click this back to normal, they're here. If I change the color will change. So again, it's this really key thing that I want to hammer home, is that everything is nodes. Cool.